7 weeks before the first chimney cracked, Daniel Riener had already turned down more paid work than most blacksmiths accepted in a year. A wagon shaft waited unrepaired outside his forge. 2 plowshares sat forgotten in a bucket by the door. A cavalry officer from Fort Assiniboine had ridden through twice looking for a matched set of spurs, and both times he had ridden away empty-handed. Inside the forge, Daniel was hammering iron nobody had ordered. He was shaping coils. Long, curling ribbons of black iron that looked less like the beginnings of a stove and more like the innards of some strange machine dragged out of a European cellar. People stopped what they were doing to watch him work. Some simply stared. Some shook their heads. One man laughed out loud through the open double doors of the smithy. "A blacksmith with a full order book," he said, "has no business building a monument to his grandmother." Daniel heard him. So did the boy pumping the bellows. So did the horses tied to the rail outside. The hammer kept falling. The laughter stayed behind. What nobody understood that late August afternoon in the town of Ash Hollow, Montana, was that winter had already begun writing a letter to the valley, and Daniel's strange coiled stove was going to be the only thing in the county capable of answering it. Before he ever swung a hammer in Ash Hollow, Daniel Riener had already buried more than most men his age. His mother died aboard a steamer crossing from Bremen the year he turned 9. His father followed her within a decade, worn thin by pit work in the coal country of Pennsylvania. What remained afterward was a small chest of tools, a cracked leather journal filled with pencil drawings, and a grandmother named Charlotte who had raised him from that 9th year forward. Charlotte Riener had come out of a village in the Ore Mountains, where winters lasted longer than the harvests and firewood cost more than bread. In her childhood cottage, a single stove had heated 4 rooms for an entire day on a single load of split pine. She could still describe every seam of that stove 50 years after leaving it behind. She could describe the way its flue curled back on itself 3 separate times before ever reaching the chimney. She could describe how a family survived the coldest nights with almost nothing left to burn, because the stove itself had become the fire long after the wood had turned to ash. She had sketched that stove in her leather journal during the last winter of her life. Page after page of coiled pipes, layered masonry chambers, hollow shelves designed to trap heat instead of chase it up a flue. She told Daniel there was no reason such a thing could not be built again, only larger in heavier iron, by a man who understood a hammer. Then she died quietly in her chair one February morning, still holding the journal open across her lap. Daniel arrived in Ash Hollow the summer after her funeral. He set up a forge on the edge of town, kept his prices honest, and asked nobody about their business. For nearly 2 full years, he was simply the German smith at the end of Front Street. Quiet, reliable, a man who made a good hinge and never complained about the weather. Then, in the final week of August 1892, without warning, he closed his order book. The first person to notice was Mordecai Vane, the town's banker and the loudest voice in every room he entered. Vane had come by to inquire about a set of parlor andirons and found Daniel bending an iron coil that looked, to his eye, like a snake trying to swallow its own tail. He watched for a full minute before speaking. Then he laughed, not a chuckle, a real chest-deep laugh that carried out into the dust of Front Street. "Riener," he said, "what in God's name are you building?" Daniel did not look up from the anvil. "A stove." Mordecai Vane laughed again, harder this time. He walked a slow circle around the workbench and studied the coils of iron with the same look he gave a farmer requesting a loan he had no intention of approving. The banker was a tall man with polished boots and a silver watch chain that caught the light every time he moved. In a town where most men wore wool that had been patched more than washed, Mordecai Vane's coat marked him as clearly as a brand. "A stove," he repeated. "Riener, I have seen stoves. My mother had a stove. My wife has a stove. The schoolhouse has a stove. None of them look like this." He tapped one of the coils with a knuckle. The iron rang softly. "This looks like something a man builds when he has stopped worrying about being paid." Daniel set down his hammer. He wiped his forehead with the back of his forearm and looked at Vane directly for the first time. His eyes were the pale gray of river ice, and they gave away nothing. "A stove burns wood," he said. "That much is true, but a stove can also waste wood. Most of them do. This one will not." Vane smiled the way a man smiles when he is about to make a joke he intends to repeat all evening. "And how much wood will your grandmother's contraption need to warm a room?" "An armload," Daniel said. "Once a day, maybe twice in the worst weather." The banker's smile widened into something closer to disbelief. He looked around the forge as though searching for a witness. The bellows boy, a 14-year-old named Silas Corbin, kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Vane turned back to Daniel. "An armload, once a day, in a Montana January. Yes, Rioneur, I have been in this valley for 11 years. I have seen men freeze inside their own cabins with 3 cords stacked against the wall. And you are telling me your iron snake is going to hold heat for 24 hours on a single armload of pine?" "I am telling you the design will," Daniel said. "Whether I build it correctly is a different question." That answer stopped Vane for a moment. It was not the answer of a boastful man. It was the answer of a craftsman describing a problem he was still working through. For a brief second, the banker's smile faltered. Then he recovered, patted the iron coil the way one might pat a horse he did not intend to buy, and stepped back toward the doorway. "Well," he said, "I look forward to seeing Daniel's folly finished. I imagine it will make quite a monument in your yard once you realize it will not draw." He tipped his hat and walked out into the sunlight. His laughter carried down Front Street the way smoke carries on a still morning, drifting into every open doorway between the forge and the bank. By suppertime, half the town had heard the phrase. By the following afternoon, the other half had adopted it. Daniel's Folly. The name stuck the way pitch sticks to bark. It stuck to the coiled iron on his workbench. It stuck to the pile of fire brick beginning to accumulate behind the forge. It stuck to the man himself. Daniel did not argue. He had learned something during the long winters of his childhood in a Pennsylvania coal town, and he had learned it again beside his grandmother's chair during her final months. People rarely understand a stove when it is working. Understanding usually arrives after a stove fails. By then, the lesson costs much more than the argument would have. So he went back to his coils. And winter, somewhere far above the northern plains, began drafting its first cold instructions. The stove Daniel Rioneur was building was not the kind any catalog in Chicago sold. A common parlor stove could heat a room quickly. It could also lose that heat just as quickly once the fire burned down. A kitchen range could cook a meal and warm a corner of the house at the same time, but it demanded constant feeding and left half the room cold by morning. Charlotte Rioneur's design worked differently. Its bones were coiled iron tubing arranged in 3 tight loops that carried hot gases through a longer path before they ever reached the chimney. Its skin was masonry, fire brick on the inside, soapstone on the outside, held together with clay slip and iron banding. Instead of rushing straight up the flue, warmth spent more time inside the stove, more time inside the room, more time doing useful work. That was the principle. That was the whole idea. Charlotte had drawn it in her leather journal with the patience of a woman who had spent her childhood in a house where fuel was measured by the stick, not by the cord. Daniel worked the design in pieces. The coils came first, hammered from wagon wheel iron he bought cheap from a wheelwright named Otis Cole. The masonry shell came next, built from fire brick freighted in from a kiln in Bozeman at a price that made his savings account thinner than he liked to admit. The soapstone panels came last, cut and shaped by a Norwegian mason in Great Falls who owed him a favor from 2 years back. Nothing about the stove was cheap. Nothing about it was fast. And nothing about it looked like anything the men of Ash Hollow had ever seen sitting in a parlor. Silas Corbin, the bellows boy, watched the work take shape and asked more questions than any of the adults. He was a thin child, all elbows and knees, with hair the color of straw and hands already scarred from a year of pumping bellows without gloves. His father had died in a mining accident near Butte the previous spring, and his mother took in washing to keep him fed. Silas had come to the forge looking for work, and Daniel had given him a place at the bellows because the boy asked good questions and did not flinch from heat. "Why 3 coils?" Silas asked one afternoon, watching Daniel fit the second loop into position. Because 2 is not enough, Daniel said, and 4 would cool the gas too much before it reached the chimney. Then the flue would tar over inside a month and you would have a fire in your roof by Christmas. How did your grandmother know that? Daniel paused. He looked at the coil in his hands and turned it slowly, examining the seam. She grew up in a house where her father built stoves for the mining villages. He built one wrong the first winter. A family lost a child. He spent the rest of his life making certain no other man made the same mistake. My grandmother learned to draw before she learned to write. Every drawing she made was of a stove. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question Daniel had been waiting for since the first day the boy walked into the forge. Why does everyone laugh at you? Daniel set the coil down on the anvil. He looked toward the open doorway, where the light of a late September afternoon was falling gold across the hard-packed dirt of Front Street. Somewhere down the block, a wagon rattled past. A woman called to a child. The town was going about its business the way towns do when they still believe the world has not changed. Because it has not gotten cold yet, Daniel said. That is the whole reason, nothing more. Silas thought about that. Then he went back to the bellows without another word. By the middle of October, the folly had begun to take a shape people could recognize. It stood nearly 6 feet tall in the corner of Daniel's workshop, wider at the base than at the top, with the 3 iron coils visible through the open front and the soapstone panels not yet fully mortared into place. Anyone who walked past the open forge door could see it now, and by the end of the second week of October, nearly everyone in Ash Hollow had. The reactions fell into a pattern Daniel had expected. The men laughed. The women looked at it thoughtfully and moved on. The children pressed their faces against the doorframe and asked questions their parents shushed. Mordecai Vane came by every few days, ostensibly to check on the andirons he had never actually ordered, and each visit ended with a comment loud enough to carry into the street. Rionur, that thing is going to eat firebrick for breakfast. Or, Rionur, when you finish that monument, you should charge admission. Or the one that stung the most because it was the closest to what the whole town was thinking. Rionur, you have spent 3 months on a stove that will not draw. What kind of man does that? Daniel did not answer any of them. He fitted the soapstone. He tightened the iron banding. He mixed clay slip in a wooden bucket and troweled it into the seams with a mason's care. Then, on the second Tuesday of October, a woman named Ada Merrick walked into the forge. She was the schoolteacher. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and the daughter of a preacher who had died the previous winter of the same lung fever that had taken half a dozen others in the valley. She had come to Ash Hollow 4 years earlier, and she had been teaching the town's children in a one-room schoolhouse ever since. She was small and quick-eyed and wore her hair in a plain braid down her back, and when she spoke like a person who had spent a great deal of time being interrupted and had learned to say her piece before anyone could stop her. Mr. Rionur, she said, standing in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her. I want to ask you about your stove. Daniel looked up from his workbench. He had never spoken to Ada Merrick before, though he had seen her at the general store, and once at a church supper he had left early. He set down his hammer. You are welcome to look at it, Miss Merrick. She came closer. She walked around the folly the way a person walks around a horse she is thinking of buying. She crouched down and looked at the firebox opening. She stood up and looked at the top of the third coil where it would eventually meet the flue. She placed a hand against one of the soapstone panels and held it there for a moment. Then she straightened and turned to face him. The schoolhouse stove is cracked, she said. The firebox has a fissure running from the loading door to the ash pan. I noticed it in the spring and I mentioned it to the school board. They said they would repair it before winter. They have not repaired it. It is now October. I have 22 children in that room every day, and the temperature was 38 degrees inside the schoolhouse this morning when I arrived to light the fire. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, Who is on the school board? Mordecai Vane is the chairman, she said. The other 2 members do what he tells them to do. Daniel nodded slowly. Something in his jaw shifted, though his face did not otherwise change. "How much time do you think the current stove has, Miss Merrick?" "I do not know," she said. "Not long enough." Ada Merrick did not stay long that afternoon. She thanked Daniel for hearing her out, adjusted the shawl at her shoulders, and walked back toward the schoolhouse through the pale October light. She had not asked him for anything. She had not asked him to fix the schoolhouse stove or to donate his folly or to speak to the school board on her behalf. She had simply told him what she saw, and then she had left. That, Daniel decided later, was the reason he could not stop thinking about her visit. He went to see the schoolhouse stove himself the following morning. He arrived before Ada did, walked around to the back of the small clapboard building, and let himself in through the woodshed door. The stove sat in the center of the single room, a heavy cast iron parlor stove that had been serving the town's children for at least 15 years. Daniel crouched in front of it and ran a thumb along the firebox seam. The fissure was exactly where Ada had described it. It was longer than he had hoped. It was also wider at the bottom than at the top, which meant the crack was still growing. He stood up and looked around the room. 22 small desks arranged in 5 rows. A chalkboard at the front with yesterday's arithmetic still written across it. A row of coat hooks by the door. A framed picture of a President Daniel could not immediately name. The single stove in the center that was the only thing standing between 22 children and a Montana winter. He walked back to his forge and did not speak to anyone for the rest of the day. That evening, after Silas had gone home, Daniel sat down at his workbench with his grandmother's leather journal open in front of him and did calculations. He had built the folly for a large parlor, perhaps the sitting room of a 2-story house. The schoolhouse was larger than that, but not by as much as he had feared. The ceiling was low. The walls were tight. The windows had been recently reglazed with proper putty. If the folly could be moved, if the flue could be adapted to the existing chimney, if the school board could be persuaded to allow it, then the folly could heat that schoolhouse. It could heat it well. It could heat it on almost nothing. The trouble, of course, was the school board. The next morning, Daniel walked to the bank. Mordecai Vane was at his desk when Daniel came through the door, and the banker looked up with the practiced surprise of a man who had been expecting no visitors and was pleased to have one to entertain. "Reunur," he said. "Come to open an account or take out a loan against your monument." "I have come to talk about the schoolhouse stove," Daniel said. Vane's smile did not change, but something behind his eyes did. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Daniel remained standing. "The firebox is cracked," Daniel said. "Miss Merrick told me. I went and looked. She is right. That stove will not last the winter. The school board is aware of the situation," Vane said smoothly. "We have the matter in hand." "Then when will it be repaired?" "In due course." "In due course is not a date, Mr. Vane. It is October 15th. The first hard freeze will come inside 3 weeks. Do you have another stove ordered?" Vane leaned back in his chair. The smile widened. "Reunur, are you here to sell me your folly?" "I am here to offer to install it in the schoolhouse," Daniel said. "At no charge. I will move it. I will fit the flue. I will show Miss Merrick how to run it. You will not pay $1. The banker laughed. Mordecai Vane's laugh filled the small bank office the way smoke fills a room with a bad flue. It came out of him in 3 separate bursts, and each burst seemed to give him more pleasure than the last. He wiped the corner of his eye with a knuckle. He shook his head. He looked at Daniel the way a man looks at a child who has proposed something charmingly absurd. "Reunur," he said finally. "That is the most generous offer I have received in this office all year. And it is also the most impossible." "Why is it impossible?" "Because I am not going to let you install an untested experiment in a building full of 22 children. That is why. Because your grandmother's contraption may look impressive standing in your forge, but I do not know that it draws. I do not know that it heats. I do not know that it will not smoke those children out of that room within an hour of being lit. And I am not going to find out on the coldest morning of January. The school board will repair the existing stove. The matter is settled. When? When it is convenient." Daniel stood in the office for a moment longer. He looked at Vane. He looked at the framed certificates on the wall behind Vane's desk. He looked at the polished brass inkwell and the silver watch chain, and the coat that cost more than most men in the valley earned in a season. Then he nodded once, put his hat back on his head, and walked out. He did not slam the door. He closed it carefully behind him, the way a man closes a stove door on a good coal bed. Back at the forge, he told Silas nothing about the conversation. He simply picked up his hammer and went back to work on the folly. The final soapstone panel needed fitting. The flue collar needed truing. The damper needed a stop bolt he had been meaning to install for 2 weeks. He worked until the light failed. He worked the next day and the day after that. By the end of October, the folly was finished. He built a test fire in it on the last night of the month. He used a single armload of dry pine, split small. He lit it at 7 in the evening with Silas standing beside him, and the two of them watched the smoke drift up through the coils and out the chimney of the forge in a thin, steady ribbon. The stove drew perfectly. The masonry warmed slowly, the way masonry does. By 9 o'clock, the workshop was warmer than it had been all autumn. By 11, Daniel banked the coals and shut the damper down to a whisper. He and Silas went home to bed. At 6 the next morning, Daniel walked back to the forge in the dark. The temperature outside had dropped to 22 degrees, cold enough to freeze the water in the horse trough. He opened the workshop door, expecting to find the room chilled through. It was still warm, not hot, not comfortable in the way a fresh fire is comfortable, but warm. The masonry was radiating heat that had been stored 11 hours earlier. Daniel crouched in front of the firebox and opened it. A bed of orange coals still glowed under a layer of pale ash. He added 2 small splits of pine, adjusted the damper, and closed the door. Within 20 minutes, the workshop was warmer than it had been the night before. Silas arrived at 7 and stopped in the doorway. He looked at the folly. He looked at Daniel. He looked at the folly again. "It worked," he said. "It worked," Daniel agreed. "Are you going to tell Mr. Vane?" Daniel shook his head. "No, winter will tell him." November came in gently. That was the thing about the winter of 1892 that everyone in the valley would remember afterward, and it was the thing that fooled them. The first 2 weeks were mild. Frost in the mornings, thawing by noon, the kind of weather that let a man keep working outside without a heavy coat. Wagons still moved freely on the roads. The last of the hay came in. The general store did brisk business in flour and salt pork and lamp oil, and Mordecai Vane was heard to remark more than once that this was going to be an easy winter. Daniel Riener watched the sky and did not agree. He had spent enough time listening to his grandmother describe the winters of her childhood to know what to look for. A slow start, a false ease, a stillness that hung over the valley the way a held breath hangs in a cold room. The horses at the livery on Front Street began facing north in the middle of November, all of them, for hours at a time, without eating. The magpies stopped scolding. The smoke from the town's chimneys began drifting sideways instead of climbing, then began settling toward the ground before it drifted at all. These were not the signs of an easy winter. These were the signs of something making up its mind. He said none of this to anyone except Silas, and even to Silas he said it only once. He said it while the two of them were carrying a load of fire brick back into the workshop for a small repair. He said, "Watch the smoke this week. If it stops climbing, we have about a fortnight." Silas watched the smoke. It stopped climbing on the 18th of November. The schoolhouse stove cracked further on the 22nd. Ada Merrick came to the forge that afternoon and told Daniel about it herself. The fissure had lengthened during a hot burn on the coldest morning yet, and a hairline crack had appeared across the top plate. She had put the fire out, opened the windows to clear the smoke, and dismissed the children early. The school board had been notified. The school board had promised action. "What action?" Daniel asked. "Mr. Vane says the repairman from Great Falls will come as soon as he can be spared." "When was he last available?" Ada looked at Daniel. "September." Daniel set his hammer down on the anvil. He wiped his hands on his apron. Outside the open workshop door, a thin snow had begun to fall, the first real snow of the season, and it was falling in the peculiar way that meant the air above the valley was carrying more water than it should. Not a dry powder, not a proper flake, something in between. Something wet enough to stick to iron and glass and stone as soon as it landed. "Miss Merrick," he said. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I would like an honest answer." "Of course. If the schoolhouse stove cannot be lit tomorrow morning, what will you do?" She thought about it for a moment. Ada Merrick was a woman who considered questions before she answered them, which was one of the reasons Daniel had come to respect her in the 6 weeks since her first visit. Finally, she said, "I would send the children home. Their parents would keep them there. Most of those families burn poor stoves in drafty cabins. Half of them would spend the winter sick. 2 or 3 would not survive it. Miss Haverson's youngest already had lung fever in October. The Corbin boy walks 2 miles from a cabin with a broken window." At the mention of Silas's family, Daniel glanced toward the bellows. Silas was pretending not to listen. He was pumping the bellows at half speed and staring at the floor. "Then I need you to do something for me," Daniel said. "I need you to keep going to that schoolhouse every morning. Whatever happens with the stove, keep going." Ada nodded. She did not ask why. The storm arrived on the morning of the 3rd of December. It did not arrive the way most Montana storms arrived. There was no wall of cloud rolling down from Canada, no wind that stripped the breath out of a man's chest, no whiteout that swallowed the town within an hour. This storm came quieter. It came as freezing rain, the kind that falls onto a landscape already trapped well below zero and hardens the moment it touches anything solid. By noon, every chimney flue in the valley had begun to ice over. The problem was not the cold. Ash Hollow had survived colder days. The problem was that the freezing rain coated the tops of the chimneys and the throats of the flues in a shell of clear ice that grew thicker with every hour. The fires below, starved of proper draft, began to smoke. Kitchens filled with the smell of poorly burning pine. Parlors filled with a bluish haze. Families opened their doors to clear the air and let the cold rush in, and then they closed the doors again and tried to relight the fires, and the smoke came back within the hour. The Haverson family was the first to abandon their cabin. Mother, father, 3 children, walking through freezing rain toward the general store because Miriam Bell kept a large parlor stove and had told the Haversons 2 winters earlier that they were welcome in her back room any time they needed shelter. The Corbins came next. Silas's mother, wrapped in 2 shawls, carrying a bundle of what looked like all the clothing she owned. By 2 in the afternoon, 7 families were huddled in the back of the general store, and Miriam Bell was rationing her firewood by the piece. At the schoolhouse, Ada Merrick was doing exactly what Daniel had asked. She had walked to the school at 6 in the morning through freezing rain, arrived at 6:40, and lit the cracked stove because she had no other choice and 22 children were expected at 8. The stove had burned for 90 minutes. Then the top plate had split cleanly across, and a jet of smoke had shot into the room, and Ada had understood in that instant that the schoolhouse was finished for the winter unless something happened that she could not yet imagine. She opened the windows. She got the fire out. She waited by the door. The children began arriving at 7:40. Their parents dropped them off and hurried away, most of them heading back to cabins full of smoke, believing the schoolhouse would be a warm place while they worked out what to do at home. Ada did not tell them the stove was broken. She could not bring herself to send those children back out into the freezing rain. She let them come in. She let them keep their coats on. She lit every lamp in the room to add what warmth she could. She organized the older children into reading circles and the younger ones into a huddle near the interior wall where the least cold came through. She waited. At 9:15, the door of the forge on the far end of Front Street opened, and Daniel Riener stepped out into the freezing rain. Behind him, harnessed to a heavy sled he had built the previous week and told no one about, was his workhorse Blackleg, an aging gelding with the patience of a monk. On the sled, wrapped in canvas and lashed with rope, was the Folly. Silas came out of the forge behind him, bundled to the eyes, holding a coil of extra flue pipe across his shoulders. "You are certain about this," Silas said. "I am certain," Daniel said. They started toward the schoolhouse. The freezing rain hissed against the canvas covering the stove. The sled runners cut 2 dark lines through the ice. Down the street, someone was watching from a second-floor window. It was Mordecai Vane. The trip from the forge to the schoolhouse was less than 400 yards. Under any other conditions, Daniel could have walked it in 5 minutes. On the 3rd of December, it took him nearly 2 hours. The ice on the street was clear and hard and cambered wrong for a sled. Blackleg slipped twice in the first 50 yards, and Daniel had to stop and coax him back onto his feet each time. Silas walked beside the sled with a bag of coal ash slung over his shoulder, sprinkling it in the horse's path a handful at a time. It was the oldest teamster's trick in a hard-freeze country, and it worked well enough for slow going. But every dozen yards Daniel had to stop and check the ropes. The folly weighed close to 700 pounds. A shift of even a few inches on the sled would tip it, and a tipped stove on a sheet of ice would be the end of everything. Mordecai Vane came out of the bank at the halfway point. He stood on the boardwalk with no coat on and watched Daniel and Silas inch past. He did not speak. He did not laugh. His face was white, and his mouth was drawn in a thin line that Daniel had not seen on him before. Behind him in the bank window, a boy of about 11 was pressing his face against the glass. That was Peter Vane, the banker's only son, and Peter Vane was watching the sled with the concentrated attention of a child who understands that something important is happening and does not yet understand what. Daniel did not stop. He touched the brim of his hat once as he passed, and he kept walking. They reached the schoolhouse at 11:15. Ada Merrick opened the door before Daniel could knock. She had been watching from the window. The children behind her were still in their coats, still huddled against the interior wall, and their breath was visible in the air of the classroom. Ada took one look at the sled and the canvas-wrapped folly and understood immediately what Daniel intended. "Where?" she said. "Center of the room, where the old one was. The old one is still there. Then it needs to come out." They moved the cracked stove together, Daniel and Ada and the two oldest boys in the classroom, a Haverson and a Peterson, who were both 14 and both stronger than they looked. They dragged the broken stove out the back door on a pair of skids Daniel had brought with him. They swept the hearth clean. Daniel measured the flue collar against the existing chimney pipe and found it 2 inches short, exactly as he had calculated, and produced from his pocket the adapter he had forged for that specific purpose 3 weeks earlier. Getting the folly off the sled and into the schoolhouse took another 40 minutes. Every man in the room worked. 2 of the older girls kept the smaller children back against the far wall. Ada directed the placement of the skids with the calm authority of a person who had been organizing children for 4 years and had learned that panic was a luxury a teacher could not afford. The folly moved across the floor in 6-inch increments. It settled onto the hearth at 12:50. Daniel connected the flue. He checked every seam twice. He built a fire in the firebox with kindling from the school's woodshed and 1 small armload of split pine. He lit it at 1:15. The smoke went up the chimney in a thin, steady ribbon. It did not roll back into the room. It did not falter. The 3 coils of iron began to warm within 10 minutes. The soapstone panels began to warm within 30. By 2 o'clock, the 22 children were taking off their coats. By 3, they were laughing again. By 4, Mordecai Vane was standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse with his hat in his hand. Mordecai Vane did not come inside at first. He stood in the doorway with the freezing rain still glazing the shoulders of his coat and looked at the folly the way a man looks at something he has spent months arguing did not exist. The children had gone quiet when they saw him. Ada Merrick did not tell them to resume their reading. She simply waited. Peter Vane was standing beside his father, holding his father's hand. The boy was staring at the stove. "Mr. Riener," Vane said finally. His voice was not the voice Daniel had heard in the bank office 6 weeks earlier. It was smaller. It was also honest in a way Daniel had not thought Mordecai Vane capable of being. "May I come in?" "It is not my schoolhouse," Daniel said. "Ask Miss Merrick." Ada nodded once. Vane stepped inside and removed his hat. He walked slowly to the center of the room and stood in front of the folly for a long time without speaking. He put a hand near the soapstone. He did not touch it. He could feel the warmth from 6 inches away. "I have 4 families in my parlor," he said quietly, still looking at the stove. "The Haversons are at the general store. There are people in this valley tonight who cannot light a fire in their own houses. My chimney iced over at 10 this morning. My wife is sitting in our kitchen wearing every coat she owns." He turned to face Daniel. "How many people will this heat?" "This room," Daniel said, "warm through the night on one more armload of wood. And a larger one. A larger one would heat a church." Vane was quiet. Then he said, "Reiner, I would like to commission one for the bank, for my house, for the church, for whatever building in this town needs one. Name your price." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Peter Vane, still holding his father's hand, still staring at the folly with the concentrated attention of a boy who had understood something today that no schoolroom would ever have taught him. He looked at Silas Corbin, who was standing by the woodshed door watching the exchange with wide eyes. He thought about his grandmother's leather journal and the sketches she had made in the last winter of her life, and the village in the Ore Mountains where a stove had once heated 4 rooms for a day on almost nothing. "I do not want money, Mr. Vane." "Then what?" "Apprentices," Daniel said. 6 boys, your son among them. I will teach them the trade. I will teach them this stove. I will teach them why it works and how to build it. By spring they will be able to build one on their own. That is my price." Mordecai Vane looked at his son. Peter looked back up at his father with an expression Daniel would remember for years afterward. It was not fear. It was hope. "Done," Vane said. The families of Ash Hollow slept in the schoolhouse that night. 22 children plus their parents plus their grandparents plus everyone whose chimney had iced over. 63 people in all, arranged in shifts across the floor of the single warm room in a valley that had otherwise been surrendered to winter. The folly burned one more armload of wood between 1 o'clock in the morning and dawn. By spring, 6 boys were learning the trade at Daniel's forge. Silas Corbin was the foreman. Peter Vane was the youngest. By the following winter, 4 public buildings in the county carried the same stove in their central rooms. The design was no longer called Daniel's Folly. It was called the Charlotte Stove, after a woman who had died in a chair in Pennsylvania holding a leather journal open across her lap, having lived long enough to teach her grandson everything she knew and having trusted him to build the rest.